This is our second session on the topic of thawing the frozen middle. And we've had this topic before because one of the big challenges that a lot of people in the DEI space face is how they can address the middle management, engage middle management, supervisors, managers, and so forth, and get them involved in this process. And today, to talk about this topic, our guest is a perfect person to have for this topic. It's Jim Morris, CEO of Jim Morris Consulting. He's the author of Gaslights and Dog Whistles, Standing Up for Facts Over Fiction in a Fearful and Divided World. So, Jim, welcome to Sharpening the Axe. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Jim, one of the things I want to jump right into is, what is the goal of your book, Gaslights and Dog Whistles, Standing Up for Facts Over Fiction in a Fearful and Divided World? I love the title only because it describes a condition that exists and something that needs to be addressed. But I would love to hear you talk about what it is that inspired you to write this book.
Well, thanks. And to be honest, Joe, it's not different than the frozen middle, but it's a little off from the frozen middle. So it was kind of a diversion for me, but I felt like an important one. And the reason I wrote it was in 2020, a group of people that were really against diversity, equity, and inclusion, mostly because they thought it wasn't systemic. And it's just, the problems that we have with diversity and inclusion are not the result of a systemic problem, but of a few bad actors. They had developed a whole process for how to undermine and interrupt training and learning around diversity, equity, and inclusion, including eliminating talking about the real history of racial justice, discrimination, bias, enslavement in the United States. So they they literally had a field guide. So I was like, okay, this is not all right. So I wrote a field guide, if you will, to talk about how, if you want to stand up for DEI and why it's important and what it means and what critical race theory, for example, really is, because of course it was being spewed as to be something that it wasn't. So I wrote this book. It's only I think it's 20,000 words, which is a big memo, more than it is even a book. And it was really meant to be a handbook for people who weren't sure what to say. They felt like they were being caught flat-footed when somebody says, well, we got to stop teaching critical race theory. Well, not really. Critical race theory is not anything back like what it was being characterized as. So it was an opportunity just to kind of share the alternative story that actually is on facts. So, and incidentally, I'm sure you know that gaslight became one of the words of 2022. It was like one of the most popular words in 2022, which I don't see as a good thing, incidentally.
I agree with you. It's really interesting when we look at the topic of your book and what you were just talking about now. It seems like from that period of 2020 that you're talking about to now, the idea of critical race theory, woke is another thing that some people, when they say woke, it sounds like they're saying a curse word, right? Woke. It has a negative connotation to it. And indirectly, or perhaps even directly, these are attacks on a lot of the work that people do in the DEI space, and they're masked as being logical. And I've even heard some more liberal pundits picking up on this and saying, well, all this woke stuff, it's gone too far. And I'm thinking, this is something that needs to be addressed. It can't just be ignored. It's not going to go away. And I think that when we opened and we talked about the people that we refer to as the frozen middle, which are the middle managers and so forth in organizations, literally most of the people that are in that group belong to the cohort that is on this gravy train, the anti-woke, anti-CRT. Now, in an organization, they may not run around flagrantly saying they hate all this woke stuff and they think that all of it is just frivolous nonsense or that it's unnecessary for critical race theory or any of those things. But either covertly or overtly, they're offering some type of resistance. And it's not resistance that can be ignored. We're certainly not going to unfreeze the middle unless we address that. So based on your research, what's fueling this? And then maybe we could talk a little bit about how do we address it once we understand where it's coming from.
Yeah, I think thanks. That's a great question. And the woke thing is really troubling. And the whole characterization of DEI as a trend or some sort of social movement versus, in my opinion, in the context of business, DEI is probably the most relevant business strategy of our generation if we really pay attention to it. So when I don't want to, I hate to get political because I don't feel political about it. I feel like it's sometimes just misinformation. It's like, but when people start saying we're going to get rid of DEI in our state, it's like, I feel like saying, well, great. Then what's your strategy for promoting growth and economic prosperity in your state? Because DEI, by most people's research, says that it's the best strategy for what we need to do in terms of producing economic prosperity. So, I feel like we should be asking them that question. And when they say woke, we should say, well, what does woke mean? What do you mean by woke? Because you're right. What they really mean is, it's politically correct nonsense, right? Like if you're the woke, whatever means, the people that are just worried about being politically correct. I'm not concerned about being politically correct. I didn't write the book because of political correctness. I wrote the book because I think we're at threat for losing an important strategy that's very much at play throughout the world. Whether we pay attention to it or not, the people that are going to win are the people that understand how to do it. So I'm pretty passionate, as you can tell, I'm kind of passionate. I'm fairly opinionated about that and pretty passionate about it. But here's where I think the frozen middle piece comes in. And I will own that I think me and people like me have some responsibility, or I and people like me have responsibility for some of what's happened, because I think we missed some important changes in the landscape between 2020 and 22. And this will take just a minute, so I hope it's worth it. But a lot of diversity training was based on educating leaders on what it feels like to be a member of an underrepresented group. They were expect to explain kind of having an understanding for, and I think this is a good thing, what it might feel like to be a minoritized or oppressed or underrepresented person in a workplace, in an organization, and how that their feelings and their experience was so different than people that look like me. So what I think we missed was the level of stress, the level of stress and mental health issues that everyone was feeling as a result of COVID. And I think this caused a backlash in DEI programs for members of the dominant, or what I call the insider group, where all of a sudden those people, their kids are struggling with mental health issues, nobody's going to school, relatives are dying. And when we come in and start talking about, well, let's focus on underrepresented groups, I think that group, in terms of their behavior, basically was saying, well, what about me? Wait a minute. All you want to do is talk about underrepresented groups. What about my experience? What about what's happening for me? And we miss that, right? We miss that. Now, it's not, this is, it's nuanced. We had to find a way to say this is not the same as, but everybody has a story, and everybody's story of hardship is valuable and real. So what's happened since then is we've made a pretty big switch to really letting everybody in our sessions talk about identity, because everybody has something they identify with. And then we have them talk about their story of hardship related to their identity. By doing that, then we're able to kind of launch into making sure people understand the difference between my occasional confrontation of issues related to me having a learning disability, for example, that come up every once in a while, and the fact that some people in the workplace on a daily basis are finding that they confront barriers that are based on bias that they have to overcome. So making that change around working on identity has been really helpful. And frankly, I think we missed the mark on part of it for the frozen middle.
That makes a lot of sense. And those are all very insightful comments. There was one thing that you also mentioned in the beginning that I want to expand on a little bit, which is this whole idea of when a lot of organizational middle managers or executives think that this is something that we do, part of it, there is some political correctness to it, or it's about being a good company and showing that we have a good brand and so forth. Think that some of that is also because there hasn't been as much information out there about the business benefit of DEI to organizations. And I was talking to you before we started this, that I was in an interview that I did back in Vegas about a week ago. And that was one of the things that I talked about in my interview, the fact that DEI is, as you said before, it's crucial to the success of businesses today. This is not just about what the organization is doing for the underrepresented. This is also about what the organization needs to do for itself. Because if we look at any reasonable piece of information, we see that the world is becoming more diverse every day. By 2045, the US Census says that minorities collectively will be the majority in the United States. And that truth is also the same in a lot of other countries. So if organizations cannot draw employees and effectively support and leverage them to be successful from that increasingly diverse pool, or if they cannot get clients from that equally diverse pool, because the client base is becoming as diverse as the workforce base,
or suppliers, or anything else, right? Yep.
Exactly. If you cannot do that, then you begin to lose relevance as a business. And this is something that's creeping up. It's like the slow boiling frog that a lot of organizations may not realize until it's a burning hot fire and they realize that they can't jump out of the pot. So I think that message isn't being conveyed as much and as strongly and as loudly. And we're still talking about DEI as if it were making penance for the past and for helping the underrepresented, and not focusing also on the fact that to you and to me and anybody who runs a business, this is an imperative if we're going to move forward. But moving on with this, in terms of the chief diversity officers, what are some of the things that they can do, Jim, to defrost the frozen middle, as it were, to touch on those topics? Because those topics that you're talking about, they're delicate topics. They can't be ignored, but you can't charge into them like a bull in the china cabinet, right? You have to approach them in the right way. So what are some of your suggestions on how they can take on some of these topics from the anti-woke, anti-CRT, and literally the anti-DEI movement that's been growing?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think everybody can do is get educated. And this is not hard. I mean, we were just talking about ChatGPT, for example. There's lots of ways to get educated pretty quickly on what critical race theory is and what some of these strategies to try and undermine DEI are. You know, my books takes an hour and a half to read at most if you're slow, right? So there are great resources out there and lots of ways to figure out more about what's real and what isn't, because we are facing a battle of misinformation and in non-information. You know, like the corporate media has had an enormous impact on people's decision making, and that's fine. But let's hope that we come back, more towards the center. Another thing for me that chief diversity officers, we just talked about it, I think need to look at is, I think because of everybody's focus and the attention people pay to social media, there's a focus on the moral argument and the outrage. It taps into our outrage about inequity. And people, the research shows that people get fired up when they have outrage. So the media and some organizations continue to feed their employees more outrageous stuff to keep people stirred up. We got to stop that, right? And to me, part of that is really talking about the business case for diversity and inclusion, to make sure that that's grounded in the daily messaging of why they're doing it, right? This is complicated. And it's even more complicated because I'm a white guy who isn't impacted by discrimination on a regular basis in our society. And I want to admit that I have an intellectual understanding, but not a visceral understanding of what it might be like to every day have to deal with the exhausting discrimination that many people have to face. But if we continue to ground this in the business case, it makes it inarguable, right? We can argue about people's lived experience. Unfortunately, it's not fair, it's not just, but it's real. But it's inarguable if we argue the business case for it. The moral case is absolutely important. I believe it's more important, but that's not what will sustain the effort. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think we need to find a way to balance, and this is something that I noticed because I do both consulting and training, right? everybody wants to hire training. Well, you know this. You've seen this forever. It's like when people aren't sure what to do in an organization, they put together a great training and everybody has this cool visceral experience and they go under the ether for a while and then they come out and say, that was amazing. But then the next thing they say is, well, now what do I do? Right? So to me, there needs to be a real, any organization that wants to do training, they better have some work on processes, procedures, and practices so that they're implementing processes, procedures, and practices that allow those leaders to enact equity on the business case, right? And I guess another way of saying that is try not to get seduced into doing more and more cool training, right? Instead, focus on creating the infrastructure to build the business case. People will join in. People will follow it. If I'm a skeptic about diversity, equity, and inclusion because I've been watching certain news channels, but I all of a sudden get a bigger end of the year bonus because my company did better, and my CEO says one of the reasons we did better is because we executed on our DEI strategy, that's going to keep me involved.
Yep.
Right? That's, as a middle manager, that's going to keep me involved. So I should come up for air and let you talk for a minute, but those are a couple of ideas.
Those are great ideas. And again, this is really important because what we see is that when we don't address these topics, the impact is maybe not that the DEI practice gets shuttered, but that its budget gets eaten up a little bit or gets reduced because it's looked at as being a nice to do or something that you do during fat times, but during lean times, you have to cut from it because it's not central to the business. And so to your point, you have to make it something that's central to the business. And that calls for identifying in your organization, in your particular space, not generalities like McKinsey says that organizations that have more diversity outperform 35% more revenue. That sounds nice, but it's disconnected from the actual company. So what you have to do is you have to dig deep into your own organization, right? And you have to find that connection of how it works. That's one of the things years ago I had to do in my outsourcing space, where clearly our ability to be able to close business had a lot to do with our ability to develop leaders for those new businesses. And the size of our bench was predicated on being able to get the maximum number of people that were in our organization who were capable, ready to be deployed as leaders. So anything that was an impediment to that was an impediment to revenue. We couldn't afford to say that only out of 35 or 40 people that we had, let's say there were 20 that were white guys or whatever, that they were the only ones that were going to be able to take on these roles, because we'd be creating a constraint to our own growth as an organization. So we have to look for that connection within our own organizations and emphasize that. That's what elevates it from being just that exercise. And then the second thing you said that I think was really something that I want to put a big underline under, because I am a strong believer that this is really important, is that the purpose of training is to raise people's awareness so that they can do something. It is not just so that they can have an excellent navel gazing opportunity and, oh, I discovered how bias works. Why, that's fascinating how my brain works and so forth, because that will last maybe a day or two. And then after that, they move on, right, with whatever it is, the business at hand. But if you take that iron while it's hot and you say, with that new awareness that you have, let's look at the policies we have in our organization through that new lens, now that it's fresh and strong, and ask ourselves, are these set up to make all of our workforce members effective? Can we leverage the most out of them, which is good for them and good for the organization? Or do we need to make certain tweaks to certain policies or practices that we have? But you've got to hit that iron while it's hot, right after that training. You can't wait a month or 2 months down the road.
Even before you book the training, I'll give you one business case that I think is a proof of this, is exactly what you're talking about. So we're working with a logistics company. And as we all know, logistics right now is an industry under siege. Right. I mean, they can't find enough people. They can't find enough drivers. They can't find enough people to work the docks. They got massive. We have massive supply chain problems. And one of the things we know about diversity, equity, and inclusion when we train well for it is that it increases people's level of trustworthiness. So if I'm seen as being a good listener, if I'm seen as being able to see you as an individual as well as a professional, If I'm able to really see you, that increases your level of trust in me. So this company said, everybody, we're going to use diversity, equity, and inclusion to expand our supply chain. If you understand diversity, equity, and inclusion, your people, the people that you work with that are our partners in logistics, are going to feel better about working with you. And we need them to feel great about working with you because they're making a decision. Should they take our freight or should they take the competitor's freight?
Yeah.
So diversity, equity, and inclusion is our means to create more trustworthiness so that we can get more of our freight shipped. Perfect connection. We walk into the room and everybody already knows why we're there, right?
Yep.
We're going to help them build better partnerships. So perfect setup. And it's just not what we normally do. Right.
I love that. That's excellent. That's an excellent way of framing it before and then utilizing it after. But that's the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to be able to help everybody contribute and make those connections. That framework that you gave in the beginning brings everybody into the room, understanding that this is part of our business process. This is not something we're doing in addition to because we want to be a good person or whatever. All these things are good, but they just don't stick in organizations. They just don't stick. So Jim, just last question for you that I have is, you've done a lot of research in this space in terms of these patterns, the anti-woke, anti-CRT patterns. Do you see them increasing or decreasing? And based on those signals, what are some of the things that DEI leaders should start to do now to make sure they seize opportunities and head off some potential obstacles?
Well, that's a great question. That's a big question. Well, to begin with, I would just encourage people to invest in DEI, not as an HR initiative, but as a value initiative, as a strategic initiative. It's important. I mean, it really is it's the strategy of our generation. It's the one that's going to make the difference. I would also say, this is indirect answer to your question. I think it's important that we give each other kind of a pat on the back. I mean, the United States is one of the greatest social experiments in the history of the world. We're the biggest, most complex country in the world trying to institute democracy. It's complicated. It's messy. It's not easy. It's contradictory. It's paradoxical, but it's democracy. So we're in a great social experiment, and a huge partner in that social experiment is commerce. So how do we continue to give each other a pat on the back, give each other some grace, give each other some support for trying, and to continue to try and head in the right direction? That's kind of the 40,000 foot level, but at a person-to-person level, at an organizational level, just to continue to embed DEI, not only in HR and what's right morally, but also really in looking at the business process and why it matters and what they're trying to achieve in terms of their business model. I'd also say that the continuing evolution of ERGs, I think, is very important. We need to make space for people. And I think having ERGs that are both open to outsiders and ERGs that are sometimes closed, so that people in those groups can have honest and confidential conversations about what they're doing to manage the struggles that they're having at work, not so that they just generate a complaint list, but so that they have the agency and empowerment to try and help shift the organization in those areas that are helpful. I see too many ERGs that are check the box activities versus business drivers for improvement. And that really, again, I mean, what's the purpose of an ERG? There's several. One of which that I think is overlooked is it should be a business driver for improvement.
Totally agree with you. In fact, you just opened the can of a whole new topic that we could probably go on for a long time, because I'm a big believer that ERGs in general tend to be underutilized resources, which is why I try to expose as many as possible in the membership group that we have, as well as in the outside world, to thought leaders that get them to think about different ways that they can add value, because they can certainly add a lot more value than just having a marquee and doing a couple of nice things during historical months and stuff like that. So absolutely. So Jim, thanks again for joining us today. Quick question for you. Again, your book title and where we can get it, and in terms of contacting you.
I'm at Jim Morris, jim-morris.net. That's me. That's my company. There you go. That takes you to my website. And that's also my email address, jim@jim-morris.net. There are a lot of Jim Morrises out there, apparently. Yeah. And then the book is available on Amazon and it's Gaslights and Dog Whistles, Standing Up for Facts Over Fiction in a Fearful and Divided World. I can brag that for 1 week we were the best. You know, you want to be a best-selling author. We were the best-selling book in the social policy category of Amazon.
Excellent.
But anyway, so you can get it there. It's a really easy read. It's also available on Audible, and there's an ebook and all that stuff. So I'd love to, yeah, anybody. And incidentally, we're doing free workshops on how to stand up for DEI for anybody who wants one. So, my business advisors say, stop saying that. But the truth is, it's part of our contribution back to the field is doing workshops so that people like HR practitioners, DEI folks can learn how to talk about this stuff when they're confronted with skeptics.
Fantastic. Well, Jim, I'm going to take you up on that offer because I have another program coming up where we might be able to do something for our members in that area. So you'll get a nice group in there. But again, thanks for joining us today on Sharpening the Axe. I appreciate having you here.
Thanks.